G'day, everybody. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to today's webinar for Australia's biggest book club, a very special webinar about crimes against humanity with Geoffrey Robertson KC, our very special guest. He is joining us from very late in the evening in London, and we very much appreciate you coming along. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Just a reminder for people joining us today that you can find our other upcoming webinars at australiainstitute.org.au. You can type questions in for Geoffrey in the Q&A box, and you should also be able to upvote and comment on other people's questions. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll boot you out. And finally, a reminder that this is being recorded and it will go up on our website later. So Geoffrey Robertson is a world-leading human rights advocate, a Sydney-sider by birth. Geoffrey became known to many Australians as the host of Geoffrey Robertson's Hypotheticals on the ABC, although he's lived and worked mostly in London since then. He founded Europe's largest human rights practice, Doughty Street Chambers, in 1990 and presented at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, served as first president of the UN's War Crimes Court for Sierra Leone, and was appointed distinguished member of the United Nations Internal Justice Council. The author of both memoirs and non-fiction books, Geoffrey's most influential work is Crimes Against Humanity, that we're here to talk about today. And it has a life story of its own. It was first published in 1999 at a time of great promise for human rights internationally. He's updated it in response to the tribunals that followed conflicts in the Balkans and Rwanda, the war on terror, the Arab Spring, and now the recent events in Ukraine and Gaza. Welcome, and thank you for joining us so late in the evening, Geoffrey.
Well, I was invited to speak at 11 a.m., which I thought was a very civilized time, but I didn't realize that the invitation had not taken account of London time, which is now past midnight. But I'm sure I won't fall asleep if your questions are sufficiently probing.
I will aim to live up to that. I wanted to start by noting in the introduction that this is the fifth edition of your book. Do you find yourself now becoming more or less optimistic about the ongoing struggle for international human rights with each new edition?
Well, it's still a struggle, isn't it? And the Trump accession makes it even more of a struggle, as I still explain in my book. Penguin were a very good publisher. They let me continue writing it until late last year. So it's up to date on Ukraine and Gaza. But I fear there may be a sixth edition in a few years to account for the damage done by Mr. Trump.
Yes, he's certainly moving at a very fast pace in the United States. We might come back to that. When you first wrote Crimes Against Humanity, you said it was a third age of human rights, one defined by enforcement, and that it was beginning to dawn around that time. And there are roughly 20 armed conflicts in the world today, obvious systemic human rights abuses alongside them. Do you still think the 21st century has been the age of human rights enforcement?
It's been an age of some human rights enforcement, and we mustn't disparage that. But there have been increasing challenges. Certainly the aggression against Ukraine is one of them, because it has exposed the weakness of the United Nations, in fact, the uselessness, I'm afraid, of the United Nations, which was set up in 1945 under a system in which the General Assembly became really a talking shop, and all power resided in the Security Council. And now that the Security Council is poleaxed and the veto is privileged to be possessed by just 5 states, 2 of them autocracies, then the essential purpose of the UN, which is expressed in its charter, namely to stop the slaughter of war, is not capable in any of those 20 conflicts of being of any use. The veto power given to these 5 countries has prevented the Security Council from doing anything meaningful. Whenever there's a resolution about ceasefire in Ukraine, it's vetoed by Russia. Whenever there's a resolution about ceasefire in Gaza, it's vetoed by America. So the UN cannot work. And big question is what we do to replace it. I was in a conference just last week in Berlin where attendees ranged from Bill and Hillary Clinton to the Russian punk band that was put in prison a few years ago. And there were leaders of Eastern European countries. There was a former president of Israel doing a double act with a former leader of Hamas. The discussion was very much how to replace the Security Council, which was of no point any longer. And it was a question of how do we protect democracy, because the UN has no protection for democracy, international law has no protection for democracy. And so that was a live question, particularly in Europe, which is offended by the Mr. Trump and his lieutenants and their attacks on their democratic allies.
Mm. So I wanted to talk next about, I guess, how so much of your work has been really focused on making sure that war criminals and international aggressors can't hide behind, just any form of impunity. Last year, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrant applications for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, along with 3 leaders of Hamas. Can you explain the significance of these warrants in the context of human rights abuses perpetrated by both Hamas and the Israeli Defense Force? What would it mean for the ICC to put these individuals on trial?
But it would mean an attack by America. But in principle, it means that the ICC is doing its job, which is to prosecute war criminals. Hamas quite clearly fall into that category. Their attack last year was obscene and criminal. The taking of hostages is outlawed by the Geneva Convention, and Israel was entitled to react, to fight back, certainly to try to free them. The question is whether it did so proportionately, and it's accused of using starvation as a tactic of war. And that is a crime, without any doubt. The crime the prosecutor has to prove beyond reasonable doubt. And the other crime which it's likely to face is that of indiscriminate bombing of civilian residences. And that should be a crime, but it isn't quite clearly under the Article 8 of the ICC Convention, which is the statement of war crimes. There are always defenses. If there is, for example, a clear military advantage in killing civilians, you can claim that as a defense. Now, many people, myself included, think it should be an absolute crime to bomb civilians. This is a war crime we see on television far too often. And children being dug out of the rubble in Gaza and in some places in Ukraine is simply not something that we can stomach. But of course, the prosecutor will have to prove that beyond reasonable doubt. Mr. Netanyahu will be put on bail. He'll be able to continue while judges work out whether, if For example, it's happened several times in search of killing one Hamas fighter. 50 refugees are killed in a bomb attack on a refugee camp. Is that proportionate? I don't think moral philosophers would think so, nor war crimes judges, but that will be a matter to be decided.
Mm. You've got a chapter in here on the question of Palestine, essentially, that touches on all of these issues. But it does seem to be an area that international law and, well, everyone else has really struggled to deal with. What's your view of where this is headed? Is this a possibility that international law can help resolve, or are we beyond that now?
Undoubtedly, it can if it's permitted to do so. The International Court of Justice, which has a very fine Australian judge, Hilary Charlesworth, as a member, has already dealt with the occupied territories and found that Israel is wrongly occupying them and should withdraw. It is currently dealing with the question of genocide, whether the killings of some 50,000 now in Gaza are justified, or whether they amount to genocide. That's a vexed question. Israel says, "Oh, we're killing Hamas. We're committing politicide, not genocide." Of course, South Africa, which is bringing the case, has another argument, and we'll have to wait till the court decides. But at any event, if it goes ahead, Mr. Netanyahu will have a very fair trial without prejudiced judges, and that will be vital. And what will be necessary is for the prosecutor, Karim Khan, to prove his case beyond reasonable doubt.
Lawyers in Sydney referred the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, to the ICC on grounds that he was an accessory to genocide. What do you make of that referral?
I make nothing of it. I think that's taking it far too far. But there is a question. Britain has faced it recently and has stopped a number of importations of arms to Israel on the basis that they are offensive weapons and can be and probably would be used to kill civilians. This is a question that the world has never effectively faced. And it goes back to Nuremberg, where Hermann Goering was not charged with the Blitz. The Blitz, you remember, was a terrible decision by Hitler and Goering to kill citizens in the East End in the hope of weakening their resolve. But the reason why he wasn't charged was because Britain was embarrassed by using the same tactics at Dresden, and the Americans were embarrassed by the Tokyo firebombing, which killed 100,000 citizens. And so they stopped Goering from being prosecuted for the Blitz. And now the question, it's the war crime we see on television, the children being taken out of the rubble of innocent civilians being killed in their own homes in Ukraine and Gaza. And of course, it should be an absolute crime, particularly the bombing of hospitals and of schools and museums. But it's not. And so we need to update the law of war to make sure that in future it is.
Thinking now about Ukraine, you say in the new chapter of the book that Vladimir Putin's invasion clearly constitutes a crime of aggression. And you suggest that an aggression tribunal should be impaneled to put Putin on trial, even if it's in absentia. If he wasn't there in person, what would such a trial achieve?
It would achieve what I think is the greatest achievement of Nuremberg, which was an authoritative judgment based on evidence that the Holocaust occurred. And it's prevented Holocaust deniers in future from claiming with any kind of support that it didn't. And telling the true story in an age when there is so much disinformation. Even Trump at one point said that Ukraine started the war, which is absolute nonsense. But it will, I think, with international judges and with evidence that can be called on both sides, because the great thing about international justice is that it doesn't matter if these criminals, if these people accused don't appear, because they have what are called amicus, lawyers who will put every argument for their innocence. So if it's a proper trial in that sense, then I think it will achieve what Nuremberg achieved, not by executing the leading Nazis, but by telling the true story. And truth is very much to be valued. I mean, you would have to give Putin very good defenders. I would. Alan Dershowitz would be happy, I'm sure, to defend him, and I wouldn't go for Rudy Giuliani. But nonetheless, so long as he is properly defended, the evidence, the facts are plain. The pictures of Russian tanks rolling towards Kiev and so forth, and any claim that it was, as Putin says, in self-defense, can be argued by experts from both sides. So an authoritative judgment translated into Russian appearing on the internet and so on would, I think, establish his criminality beyond any doubt.
Just a reminder for people who are tuned in that you can put questions for Geoffrey into the Q&A box. Thank you so much.
And I should add, Ebony, that the crime of aggression is, in the view of the Nuremberg court, the worst crime of all, because under international law, the person who starts a war is guilty of all that follows. And of course, in Ukraine, we've now had 500,000 deaths or dismemberments as a result, direct result of Putin's actions.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you about next, going back to the origins of international law. And in here, you talk about the crime of genocide and the origins of that. But I wonder if you could just take us through, I guess, the aftermath of the Holocaust and why the world decided to come together, and that these did need to be, I guess, international crimes that could be prosecuted.
Well, this was, ironically, because of the American insistence that instead of Churchill's wish that the 75 top Nazis should be given 6 hours to say their prayers and then executed, it was thought by Truman and by the Chief Justice, who acted as prosecutor, that it would not sit well on the American conscience to execute the Nazis without trial. So there was actually a dispute. Churchill was afraid that Hitler would use the dock as a soapbox to justify the Nazi strategy. And so he was opposed to Nuremberg. And it was a fight between them until, of course, the third ally, Joe Stalin, loved show trials so long as all the defendants were shot at the end of them, and he voted for Nuremberg. And hence we got this extraordinary trial and the result, which has confounded Holocaust deniers ever since.
You talk about the International Criminal Court proceedings, how they can sometimes be, in your words, I think, excruciatingly slow and intolerably expensive.
Yes.
How do we make them faster and cheaper without undermining the chances of proper global justice and in the wake of wars and genocides? Is that even possible?
Yes, it's to some extent we achieved that in my court in Sierra Leone. They were dealt with much more quickly and less expensively. But it's a problem that courts in most countries face. Justice is expensive. There's a court at the moment, or there's a core group, it's called, of 38 nations. Australia is one of them. America was until Trump got his hands on it, trying to set up an international court to deal with aggression. But it has needs money. It's got, so far, it's been funded by the European Union. And Biden gave some money, but of course, Trump will give no more. And it's part of his attack on international justice, on the International Criminal Court, which was clear by the end of his first time as president. I deal with that quite extensively in my book. It goes back to American exceptionalism, to the Jesse Helms and the Bomb the Hague Bill, the American Servicemen's Protection Act, which says that if any American ever gets caught by the International Court, the president has power to invade the Hague and release them. And this nonsense is always picked up by American presidents until George Bush, actually, who started his first term by supporting it. But by the end of his second term, he was suggesting international courts and cooperating with them because he realized that justice was not something that was partisan or was wanted by Democrats and not Republicans. But of course, Trump has reversed that. And the ICC is still important, as you can see from the arrest of Duterte the other day for shooting thousands of suspects of drug offences and without, in many cases, any evidence. Duterte was stupid because, and his lawyers even more so, all he needed to do was to fly to America, which would not have implemented the ICC arrest warrant. And that's, I think, what will happen. America will become a haven for war criminals charged by the International Court and finding a safe haven in America.
Well, I might come to Trump next. I know he's not necessarily a huge subject of the book, even though you have touched on
Well, he is.
his
I
earlier,
with what's
his earlier,
coming by analysing his first attacks on the ICC, stopping its judges and prosecutors from flying to New York and reporting to the UN.
Well, I was going to ask about that. And now, obviously, he just seems to have an appetite for disrupting, well, just about everything. But in this second administration, he's also kind of talked about potentially acquiring Greenland. There's lots of kind of wild claims that it feels like we probably need to take a bit seriously.
He wants to annex Canada. The Canadians today want to fight back because the pornography site Pornhub is based in Canada. And so they say, why don't we stop these pornography-loving Americans from accessing Pornhub in revenge for cutting our imports? I suppose most of them are Trump voters, so that might be some kind of payback. But in fact, it's an absurd suggestion. Even worse, I think, and very dangerous for democracy if it catches on, is his attack on the judiciary and his attempt in the present case to be above the law, because he claims that he can countermand an order by a judge that he should bring back the Venezuelans who were illegally deported without being given a hearing. And this is, I suppose, the ultimate. It was decided, the trial of King Charles I, that no matter how high ye be, the law is above you. And certainly the case in Britain, where Mrs. Thatcher's Home Secretary was condemned for contempt of court when he did the same thing. And we have a great case in Australia, which not many Australians know about, where a Premier of Victoria, Henry Bolte, was obsessed with hanging a man who was obviously insane, called Tate. And he fixed the execution date just before the High Court could hear his appeal. And the High Court turned up in full with Sir Owen Dixon, the great Australian Chief Justice, threatening Bolte, in effect, with imprisonment if he executed Tate before the case was heard. And Bolte slunk away and postponed the execution until Tate could be declared insane and saved, because you can't hang an insane man. And so Tate's life was saved. But the importance for Australians, if ever Peter Dutton thinks of, if he gets elected, of emulating Donald Trump, is that you just can't do it. You go to jail, because the court is final, is the ultimate. And democracy depends on this understanding of the different roles of the legislature, the government, and the independent judiciary. And to take down the independence of judges is really the undermining of democracy. And if there are more political leaders who fancy emulating Donald Trump, then it's a danger to democracy in those countries.
Are you confident that the United States judiciary will withstand these kind of assaults from the Trump administration? They're talking about impeaching judges and...
I know. It's the Chief Justice, who is himself a very right-wing conservative, had to point out that the remedy for disagreeing with the judge was to appeal his decision, not to impeach him or have political bad-mouth him in Parliament. So I think that message is certainly getting home, but it is a real peril. And that's why Trump's behavior is so serious and so antipathetic to democracy. But on the other hand, as my book points out, there is no protection for democracy. There was a lot of discussion when the League of Nations failed as to what should replace it. And H.G. Wells, the great visionary, said, well, it should be an organization of what he called parliamentary peoples, i.e. democracies. And that was possible at a time when Stalin was talking to Hitler about how to divide up Poland. But of course, as time went by, Russia became our most important ally, and at Yalta, there was no way of envisaging an international organization without Russia. Its satellites came in, then China. And so it's impossible for the UN to protect democracy. It's not mentioned at all in its charter. And international law doesn't do that either. So that's why there is increasing talk in Europe of the possibilities of replacing the Security Council by an organization of democratic states. There are 125 states signed up to the International Criminal Court. There are 54 members of the Commonwealth. There's Japan, Indonesia, Brazil, India, that are powerful democratic influences. So it is possible that we shall see emerging a democratic union that, even without America, and it may well be better off without certainly Trump's America, that will be enough to dissuade China from invading Taiwan, will put pressure on Russia to give up its war in Ukraine.
Australia used to play a leading role in advancing global human rights. And in the human rights story in Chapter 1, you talk about Doc Everett's advocacy for international human rights courts in 1945. But you also point out Australia's got a bit of a patchy human rights record of its own, ranging from the stolen generations to how we've treated asylum seekers in the past. Where do you think Australia fits in the global human rights story today?
Well, it's there. I do mention Doc Everett, who's a great figure. Jesse Street actually played an important part in those conferences in 1945. Ninian Stephen has been very important in the development of war crimes jurisprudence, and others have contributed significantly. And I think Australia has generally supported human rights while having a mote in its eye in relation to asylum seekers and deaths in custody and so on. But its contribution to international human rights law has been significant.
I did just want to ask you also about Ben Roberts-Smith, who was awarded the VC, accused of war crimes by a journalist, and he instigated the defamation action, which he lost. It did find to a civil standard of proof that the allegations against him were substantiated. He's appealed, and we don't yet have the full bench of the federal court. It hasn't yet delivered its verdict. But in the question of, irrespective of the guilt or otherwise of Ben Roberts-Smith, who is responsible for war crimes when soldiers are committing them as part of an army, I guess?
Well, quite properly, Australia followed the pattern and the rule about dealing with allegations of war crimes itself. Allegations can be dealt with under the Army Disciplinary Code, but if they are serious, as they were against Robert Smith, notwithstanding his VC, they need to be dealt with by a criminal court after an inquiry, and the Brereton inquiry did bring back allegations that needed criminal prosecution against a number of Australian soldiers, essentially for killing civilians without trial, simply, or ordering, what was worse, ordering junior soldiers to do the killing. These are war crimes, I have to say, that are committed in every war, no matter, they do say there's international humanitarian law, but wars are never, cannot by their nature be humane. In Ukraine, they've assessed 150,000 war crimes committed by troops. So it goes to show that we need, first of all, a duty to prosecute, and I think that is something that the Australian authorities are prepared to shoulder, but also an international law. War crimes have been crimes for centuries. The maltreatment of prisoners was clear by Shakespeare's time and is often mentioned in his plays. So that is maltreatment of prisoners. But now there are more important crimes to deal with, like ordering bombing of places like the theater in Mariupol, where 1,000 people were taking refuge and were known to the Russian pilots and those who commanded them. The killings in Bucha, where people were simply taken aside and executed. These can be brought home to those who start the war and those who prosecute it, and that's important. What is important also is that there is a new crime of threatening to use nuclear weapons, and indeed of using them. Bizarrely, the list of war crimes doesn't include the use of nukes, and that's because America and Russia and Britain didn't, the nuclear powers did not want a crime to consist of threatening or using nuclear weapons, and that should, of course, come about. So should a clear law against the bombing of civilian residences and churches and hospitals and so on. But that's a matter that needs attention in the future. I'm currently writing another book, I'm afraid, on the need to have proper war crimes law, and not one that goes back to the 1940s and has been manipulated, if you like, by America and Russia.
Mm. I might go now to questions from the audience, and just a reminder that you can put those questions into the Q&A box. Joanne Pearson asks, do you think there has been a decline in respect for the rule of law? And if so, what does that mean for pursuing crimes against humanity?
Well, it depends on the country and it depends on the circumstances. There has been a decline in respect in America, thanks to the election of Donald Trump. I mean, when I was a kid, I always wanted to go to study at Harvard rather than at Oxford. And I didn't, and I regretted until very recently the fact that I went to Oxford. But now I'm so glad I'm not an American. Can you imagine bringing up your children and looking for inspiration to the president and his low-life officials? I mean, once upon a time, American parents could point to George Washington, who never told a lie. And now they've got Donald Trump, who always does, and talking about going from log cabin to White House. But look at the lowlife that now inhabits the presidency and his main ministers. It's simply, I would have thought, very difficult to bring children up in any kind of moral sense with people like that. And as far as American diplomats go, you just can't trust them. You can't believe what they say because they're directed, of course, by Donald Trump and his establishment. And so I won't say more than that respect for the law is really up for grabs in Trump's America. His supporters don't respect it. On the other hand, in Europe, there's enormous respect, and people who've come out of communist societies have great respect for it because it's their protection. The rule of law is essential to any democratic state. The independence of the judges, freedom of speech, and free and fair elections are the three defining characteristics of democracy. And I think the more they've been threatened, the more people are supportive of
them. Jane has a question, which is, what is stopping Vladimir Putin from being charged right now with war crimes?
Very simple. He's not committed a crime for which the ICC has jurisdiction, that means power, to have him arrested and put on trial. That is because it was a great struggle to get the crime of aggression legislated at the United Nations and at the ICC. And it wasn't until 2018 that we got a definition and a crime. But the problem was that at the insistence of America and Britain and all those powerful countries, you could only be prosecuted if you accepted the right of the ICC to prosecute you. So the result has been there are about 45 largely democratic countries who have accepted that they can be prosecuted for aggression. And of course, they're the countries that would never invade another country. So, but Russia, of course, and China does not accept this jurisdiction of the ICC, so they can't be prosecuted. I have a view which runs counter to that of many lawyers, that we should have trials in absentia, because I see one of the great benefits of trials, as of Nuremberg, is in giving an authoritative account of who is really guilty. And I think that would be done by putting Putin on trial in absentia. But so, because the facts are clear, he claims he's got a defense of self-defense, but that can be argued by experts without his presence. And a definitive judgment, authoritative judgment, can be delivered. But I think that at the moment, there is no court which has the power to try him, but it could be tried in absentia if the ICC were given the power to deal with any aggressor and to deal with them in absentia if necessary.
Tamara and the Australian Peace and Security Forum both have questions about Australia's complicity in Israel's war on Gaza. One asking, wouldn't the Australian supply of F-35 jet fighter planes and parts, which are supplied to Israel, comprise complicity with genocide or war crimes? And Tamara had a similar question about why is it too far of a stretch that the Prime Minister might be held responsible or for being complicit?
Yeah, I think that as Britain has shown, which has taken the lead on this, there is a question of complicity with war crimes, and that Britain has taken the view that it will not supply any items, material of war which are likely to be used aggressively in and possibly commit war crimes with those instruments. And as a result, I think some 30 cases of export to Israel have been stopped. So this is certainly an inquiry that every government should take. I don't know the details of Australian involvement with arming F-35s, but they certainly are being used for destroying human life. It's interesting that Dresden, which was so dreadful in its deliberate targeting of civilians, caused, and says, only 24,000 deaths. And now, of course, in Gaza, the numbers are up to 50,000. So that just shows why I think every government should do an inventory of the arms that are supplied, not just to Israel, but certainly to any of the 20 war zones, and should ban exports if there's a reasonable likelihood that they will be used for war crimes.
Chris asks, is the lack of appropriate action by Australian governments on climate change, would that constitute another crime against humanity, in particular against the youth of the country?
This is an interesting area which is developing. I mean, people are thinking of ecocide as an international crime, particularly if it could be brought against corporations that have despoiled areas. One of the allegations against Putin is that large areas of Ukraine have been devastated and ecological damage severely done to them, and that will likely be added to any indictment of him. So there is already some provision, and some cognizance is being taken of environmental damage by international courts. There was an important case involving the Timorese Islanders in international courts. There was an important case in the European Court of Human Rights where governments, in that case the Swiss government, in the islands case the Australian government, were ordered to make better provision for the Torres Strait Islanders case. I'm sorry, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. My memory is a bit wonky. But yes, it was the Torres Strait Islanders case, which was won at the International Court, International Human Rights Court. And it was a case where, you know, the cemeteries where their relatives were buried were going under the water because Australia hadn't made proper provision for the climate change which was affecting them. So, yes, human rights is slowly beginning to make its presence felt on environmental issues. The Swiss case, the Swiss government had made all sorts of promises that it was going to be environment friendly, and it wasn't. And the court stepped in and ordered it to follow its own promises.
Bethany Lotes asked the question that recently Michaelia Cash, one of the shadow ministers here in Australia, had indicated if the coalition government were elected, that they would welcome Benjamin Netanyahu onto Australian soil. Should he come to Australia, would we be compelled to arrest him? And what would it say about our
Yes, I think
standing? We didn't.
that was a disgraceful statement by someone seeking power. Let us hope she doesn't get it. But it would mean that Australia would be in breach of international law. The case was litigated in South Africa because of the presence of Bashir, who was under indictment. He'd been charged with genocide in Darfur. And so he came, and there was a court case, and he rather quickly disappeared back to the Sudan because the court ordered his arrest, or said that the law required his arrest. And I think Australia, if it, in the unlikely event that Mr. Netanyahu, a suspected war criminal whose orders have killed many thousands, led to the killing of many thousands of citizens, was welcomed by, it would have to be Mr. Dutton. I think that Australia's prestige in the world would, certainly in the free world, would diminish if the law were not followed. But as I say, if I may, it's a hypothetical question.
The next question that I've got, a couple of people have touched on, and that is about the responsibility of the United States of Australia. Does it have a case to answer for aggression, given its multiple attacks against countries around the world?
Well, you need to be specific. You're talking about the USA.
Mm.
No, it doesn't. Of course, what everyone says in relation to charging Putin is what about Bush and Blair attacking Iraq back in 2003? And that's a good question to which there is a simple answer. There was no crime of aggression in those days. The United Nations prosecuted Goering and others for the crime against the peace, and aggression was only defined much later. It was a lot of delay, but in 2003 there was no international law against aggression. Cases against Blair were thrown out in the English courts for that reason. But of course, it was aggression, but it didn't, there was no law against it at the time. And there are other reasons why. Neither Blair nor Bush or little Johnny Howard, indeed, could be prosecuted for aggression at that time, although looking back, of course, they were guilty of it.
Melanie asks, how do you explain the silence in response to the United Nations report finding the systemic use of sexual, reproductive, and other gender-based violence by the Israeli security forces in Gaza?
Well, what I would say is that this is a common feature of war. There has been several reports about the rapes committed by Russian soldiers against Ukrainian women. It goes back in the Second World War. Stalin regarded it as one of the spoils of war for his troops to rape German women. 2 million of them were raped. You've got the comfort woman scandal in Japan. It's not new, but wherever it occurs, there is a duty on the local authorities to prosecute it.
The last question is from Laurie, who says he fears a world trend towards fascism, something his parents lived through in Europe. How can ordinary people counter this?
Well, I think everyone has a role to play. Fascism, or indeed the move to authoritarianism, the move to curb and damage civil liberties, are matters that can be taken up at a local level. They can be taken up by supporting governments that stand behind international bodies like the International Criminal Court, which does cause dictators some pause. In building up these democracies, I'm trying with others to replace the Security Council with a body that will unequivocally support democracies and be powerful in both moral sense and military sense to withhold any attack by China on Taiwan or attacks by Russia. It's interesting to see the fervor with which Europe is activated at the moment, because so many of its countries are on the border with Russia, and they know what from the past, what living under Russian communism will mean. So it's an ongoing quest to shore up democracy, to provide some support for it. I mean, I remember many years ago with George Williams, we went to Fiji to argue that one of the innumerable coups was which had thrown out the democratically elected government, argue that there was some support in international law. We had an international court with judges from Australia and New Zealand and New Guinea and Samoa, that there was some support for democracy, and the court accepted up to a point that if you overthrow a democratic government, you have, and you're challenged, you have at least to show that you have popular support. And the Fiji military government could not show that. And extraordinarily, but it was Fiji, it resigned when the court declared it illegal. In most countries, governments do not behave as sort of honorably as that. And the military coups will prevent any challenges and will continue occupying a seat on the United Nations, no matter how badly disposed they are to the freedom of their people.
Well, we thank you very much again for your time this evening, Geoffrey Robertson, and thank you everyone for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. The book is Crimes Against Humanity. It's out now in all good bookstores with the updated and revised chapters. And speaking as a non-lawyer, it's very easy to read, and it's not only an amazing kind of history of international law, but a very accessible one to, as I said, a non-lawyer. So I recommend you pick it up wherever you find it. We so much appreciate you joining us so late in the evening, Geoffrey. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we'll speak to you again soon, if not online, when you're next in Australia.
Thanks very much, Ebony.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We'll hope to see you again soon. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching. We love that we can make these videos free to watch, but they're not free to make. It's thanks to our generous supporters that we can keep making research and content that changes minds. So, if you like what we do, please consider giving to the Australia Institute so we can keep doing it. Visit our website australiainstitute.org.au and click the donate button to see how your support can help fund high quality research that matters.